Forget the movies. Forget the swinging double doors, the polished mahogany bar, the hearty plate of steak and beans set down in front of a clean-shaven cowboy by a smiling woman in a corset. The reality was a slaughterhouse with a liquor license, a parasitic industrial machine engineered to bleed every desperate man of his last copper penny while feeding him meat that was already rotting before it touched the plate. Step inside a real saloon in 1876. The first thing that hits you isn't the music, it's the smell. A suffocating wall of rancid lard, sour beer-soaked sawdust, unwashed bodies, coal smoke, tobacco spit, and the unmistakable sweetness of decomposing meat hung from a rafter 3 days too long. Flies blacken the ceiling. The communal spittoon overflows. The free lunch sitting on the bar, that legendary frontier hospitality you've heard so much about, is a salt-cured trap, a chemical weapon designed to drive your thirst into bankruptcy. The pickled eggs floating in cloudy brine, the ham crawling with maggots scraped off before service, the bread sliced by the same hand that just butchered a hog and counted a customer's coins. Over the next 40 minutes, we're going to peel back every toxic layer of this necro-economy. We'll walk the dirt floors of the boomtown saloons where dysentery killed more men than gunfights ever did. We'll uncover the engineered economic trap of the free lunch and the wage slavery of the hash house cooks who work themselves to death for $1 a day. We'll dissect the chemistry of the lethal plate, the formaldehyde milk, the borax beef, the embalmed canned meat that would later poison an entire American army. We'll witness the brutal psychological collapse of the men and women trapped in this system, the suicides, the whiskey madness, the children dead before 5. And we'll end at the mass graves and the forgotten congressional scandals that finally killed this 60-year reign of culinary brutality. If you're ready for the real history, hit subscribe, because the truth isn't cinematic. It's way worse than you think. To understand the saloon plate, you have to first understand the ground it was built on. The American frontier of the 1860s and 1870s was not the sweeping golden prairie of John Ford's camera. It was a raw, unfinished wound in the continent, a chaos of mining camps, cattle towns, and railroad junctions that erupted out of bare dirt in a matter of weeks. Deadwood, South Dakota, went from empty gulch to a population of 5,000 in under 4 months in 1876. Tombstone, Arizona, exploded from a single prospector's claim to 7,000 souls in 2 years. There were no city planners, no sanitation departments, no water inspectors, no refrigeration. The saloons that fed these populations opened in canvas tents lashed to pine poles, in unfinished plank shacks with gaps wide enough to slide a hand through, on floors of pounded earth that turned to thick black mud every time it rained. The climate alone was a slow killer of food. Summers in Dodge City and Abilene routinely cracked 110 degrees in the shade, and there was no shade. Butter liquefied in its crock by mid-morning. Milk curdled by noon. Meat hung in open air, aged from pink to gray to green within a single afternoon. The winters reversed the assault. -30 in Montana mining camps, ice thick enough on the inside of saloon windows to scrape with a knife, beans freezing solid in the pot between servings. And in every season, on every day, came the wind. The relentless prairie wind that carried fine alkaline dust through every crack and seam, settling in a gritty film over every barrel of flour, every open bowl of stew, every sliced loaf of bread on the bar. Witnesses described the dust as so constant that men chewed grit with every bite and simply stopped noticing. Now step inside. The floor is not wood, it is sawdust, sometimes 6 inches deep, laid down for one purpose: to absorb. To absorb tobacco juice spat from 100 mouths a night, missing the brass spittoons more often than hitting them. To absorb spilled whiskey, vomit from drunks too far gone to make the door, urine from men who couldn't be bothered to walk to the alley, and blood from the inevitable knife fights and pistol whippings. In a busy Kansas cattle town saloon, this sawdust was raked level once a day and replaced at best once a week. In poorer establishments, once a month. In the worst, almost never. The result was a fermenting biological carpet underfoot, stewing in the heat, releasing a sour, sickening rot every time a boot pressed down. Above this floor, the surfaces of service were no better. The communal towel hanging from the bar, the one used to wipe glasses, mop spills, and dab at sweating foreheads, was washed weekly, if at all. The shared free lunch plate sat exposed for 12 to 16 hours a day, every customer reaching in with the same unwashed fingers that had just handled coins, livestock reins, and worse. And then there were the flies. Frontier diaries and Army surgeon reports describe swarms so dense in summer saloons that the air itself appeared to move. A miner in Bodie, California wrote in 1879 that he had given up trying to keep them off his food and simply ate more insect than meat with every plate. The flies bred in the privies out back, in the manure piles in the streets, in the open butchering pits behind the kitchen, and they walked in their thousands across every piece of food served at the bar. The food itself was stored in conditions that would close any modern restaurant within 90 seconds of an inspection. Without ice, without refrigeration, without even basic ventilation, meat was hung from rafters in open air or packed into root cellars, dug directly into the same manure-rich soil that bred the flies. Pork shoulders developed crusts of mold that cooks scraped off with the back of a knife before slicing. Beef quarters turned iridescent green at the edges and were simply trimmed and served. Butter, an item shipped at staggering expense from Iowa or Missouri, was churned in lard buckets reused from the previous winter's hog slaughter, tasting permanently of rancid pig fat. Eggs, when they could be had, arrived after weeks on a stagecoach, sometimes packed in lime, often already spoiled. A single bad egg in a Deadwood saloon in 1876 reportedly cost $1.25 a full day's wage for a laborer and was eaten anyway. And over all of it hung the smell. Not a single odor, but a layered, suffocating fog that frontier travelers documented again and again in letters home. Rancid grease from a fryer that hadn't been emptied in a year. Stale beer soaked deep into wood. The ammonia sting of unwashed bodies in wool. Coal smoke. Cheap tallow candles. Tobacco. And underneath it all, the sweet, unmistakable rot of decomposing animal matter, meat, lard, milk, blood, the chemical signature of a kitchen that was, in every meaningful sense, a slow biological disaster. The smell clung to a man's clothing for days. Some travelers wrote that they could identify a saloon district from half a mile downwind. This was the architecture of the frontier plate. And we haven't even gotten to the food yet. Now we come to one of the great lies of frontier mythology, the legendary free lunch. Walk into any saloon from San Francisco to Street, Louis between 1,870 and 1,900, and you would find it laid out on a long plank along the bar. Pickled eggs floating in cloudy brine, sliced rye bread, pots of mustard, jars of pickled herring, salted peanuts, oyster crackers, hunks of cured ham, sometimes a pot of bean soup or a pyramid of cheese. A working man could eat his fill, the saying went, for the price of a single nickel beer. Generosity, the legend says. Frontier hospitality, the big-hearted barkeep feeding the hungry traveler. It was nothing of the kind. The free lunch was one of the most coldly engineered economic traps in American commercial history. Every single item on that plank had been selected for one chemical property, salt. The herring had been brined for weeks. The ham was cured to the point of being almost solid sodium. The pickles, the peanuts, the cheese, the crackers, every bite was calibrated to detonate a thirst no human throat could satisfy with a single beer. Industry trade journals of the 1880s discussed the formula openly. A patron who ate his fill of free lunch could be expected to consume, on average, 4 to 6 beers chasing the salt. A nickel meal generated 30 to 60 cents in liquor sales. The math was lethal, and it worked. Temperance reformers, often dismissed today as humorless Puritans, left some of the most chilling documentation of the system. They described again and again the same scene: a working man entering at noon for a free meal and being carried out at midnight broke, drunk, and unable to walk. They followed these men. They tracked the destruction. Wages spent in a single afternoon. Wives and children left without flour. Entire weekly paychecks consumed across the salt-soaked plank in a matter of hours. The free lunch was not charity. It was bait, set by men who had calculated, down to the gram, exactly how much your body could be pushed to drink. Behind the bar, in the kitchen, the human cost of this machine was even darker. The cooks who produced the saloon plate worked in conditions that bordered on industrial slavery. 18-hour shifts were standard. The kitchen's windowless plank rooms behind the bar, lit by tallow candles, heated by coal-burning ranges that pushed interior temperatures past 120 degrees, were documented as breeding grounds for tuberculosis, heat stroke, and chronic injury. The pay was $1 a day, sometimes 75 cents, sometimes simply meals and a cot in a back room thick with rats. The waitresses and hurdy-gurdy girls who carried the plates and poured the drinks fared even worse. In hundreds of saloons across the West, they were not paid in U.S. currency at all. They were paid in tokens, small brass or wooden discs, stamped with the saloon's name, redeemable only for goods and lodging at that same saloon. A woman who took such a job found herself locked inside a closed economy, eating the same toxic plate she served, sleeping in a room rented from her employer, washing in water bought from her employer, owing her employer for the very dress on her back. Quitting meant walking out with nothing. Many never walked out at all. And then there were the Chinese immigrants. Driven west by the railroads, then discarded by them, thousands of Chinese men ended up in saloon kitchens because no other work would have them. They were paid half what a white cook earned, sometimes a quarter. They were blamed reflexively when patrons sickened, and patrons sickened constantly. The historical record is grim and specific. Chinese cooks were lynched, beaten, and burned out of their kitchens in dozens of documented incidents from Wyoming to California, scapegoated for food poisoning that the saloon's own conditions, not the cook, had caused. They were the disposable labor at the bottom of a disposable industry. The supply chain that fed this machine was a marvel of profitable decay. Saloon owners had perfected by trial and error the art of monetizing rot. Spoiled beef became frontier stew. Meat that had turned at the edges was diced fine, drowned in chili powder, and sold as son of a bitch hash, a name that frontier diners adopted with grim humor, fully aware of what they were eating. Butter rancid past the point of recognition was whipped with fresh salt and sold as new. Eggs that had cracked in transit were beaten into pancake batter where the smell would be hidden. Nothing was thrown out. Nothing was ever thrown out. The supply lines themselves were a slow-motion disaster. Cattle driven 1,000 miles north from Texas arrived at Kansas railheads with up to a quarter of the herd dead or dying from exhaustion, disease, and contaminated water. Eggs shipped from Iowa farms reached Deadwood after 800 miles by wagon and were already past edible. Butter crossing the Mississippi in summer was rancid by Street Louis. And the prices charged for this collapsing inventory were obscene. A single egg in 1876 Deadwood, $1.25. A pound of butter in Leadville during the silver boom, $2.50, 3 full days of a miner's wages. Men paid it. They had no choice. The frontier plate was not a meal. It was a tax levied on desperation, and the saloon owner was the collector. If the saloon environment was a slow biological disaster, the food and drink itself was a chemical one. And in the unregulated American marketplace of the 1800s, that chemistry was nothing short of weaponized. There were no federal food laws, no ingredient labels, no inspectors, no accountability. A supplier in Chicago or Street Louis could ship a barrel of fresh milk to a frontier saloon that had been cut with chalk water, thickened with flour paste, and preserved with formaldehyde, the same embalming fluid used by undertakers to keep it from spoiling on the long rail journey. By the time it reached the saloon's free lunch counter and was poured into a child's cup or stirred into a cook's batter, that milk was a slow-acting poison. Documented infant mortality in the 1880s American West, traced specifically to formaldehyde-laced milk, ran into the tens of thousands. Meat received the same treatment. Boric acid, a household pesticide and roach killer, was rubbed liberally into beef and pork that had begun to turn, masking the smell of decomposition long enough to reach the customer's plate. Borax, was dusted over fish that had gone gray. Sodium sulfite was injected into ground sausage to restore the pink color of fresh meat to flesh that was, in clinical terms, already rotten. Pickles were dyed bright green with copper sulfate, a compound that attacks the liver. Candy was colored with red lead, with chrome yellow, with arsenic compounds that produced the brilliant emerald greens prized in 19th century confections. Children eating saloon candy in the 1870s were, in a measurable percentage of cases, slowly poisoning themselves. Then came embalmed beef, the ultimate expression of this chemistry. Beginning in the 1880s, large packing houses in Chicago discovered that beef, preserved with industrial concentrations of boric acid and salicylic acid, could be canned and shipped anywhere in the country, sit on a shelf for years, and still appear edible when opened. It was sold by the millions of pounds to saloons, mining camps, and eventually the United States Army. It would later be revealed that this canned meat killed more American soldiers in the Spanish-American War than Spanish bullets did. But for 2 decades before that scandal broke, embalmed beef was a staple of the frontier saloon plate. And to wash it all down, the whiskey, the legendary frontier rot gut. Real aged whiskey was expensive and slow to produce, so saloon owners produced their own. Raw industrial alcohol, often the same denatured grain alcohol used to fuel lamps, was poured into a barrel. To it was added tobacco juice for color and bite, turpentine for warmth, black pepper or red pepper for the burn that suggested age, strychnine in measured doses for the kick, sulfuric acid in trace amounts for the bite. Sometimes a dead snake or a chunk of raw beef was dropped into the barrel for flavor. This liquid, sold under names like tarantula juice, coffin varnish, and tanglefoot, was served by the gallon every night, alongside the salted ham and the formaldehyde milk. The biological consequences were catastrophic and constant. 4 diseases stalked the saloon plate like a pack of wolves: dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and the catch-all summer complaint, a category of acute gastroenteritis that killed thousands of frontier workers every year. Dysentery, the bloody flux, was the most common. The clinical progression is brutal to describe. Violent abdominal cramping that doubled men over within hours of an infected meal, followed by uncontrollable bloody diarrhea that emptied the body's fluids at a catastrophic rate. Skin grayed, eyes sank into their sockets, lips cracked and bled. The dehydration killed within 48 hours in the worst cases, the victim conscious to the end, begging for water that if drawn from a contaminated well would only accelerate the dying. The historical record is full of specific outbreaks, traceable to specific saloons. In 1873, a typhoid wave swept through Dodge City, killing dozens, eventually traced to a single barrel of oysters served across multiple bars on Front Street. In 1879, Leadville, Colorado, lost an estimated 400 residents in a single summer to a cholera outbreak whose origin investigators tied to contaminated saloon stew pots reusing well water from a source downstream of the town's privies. In Bodie, in Tombstone, and Virginia City, in Cheyenne, the same pattern repeated: a hot summer, a tainted shipment, a shared spoon, and within 10 days, fresh graves on the hill outside town. And underneath all of this, the rotten supply chain, the chemical adulteration, the climate, the disease was a single, almost incomprehensible failure. Nobody washed their hands. Germ theory, established in Europe by Pasteur and Koch in the 1860s and 1870s, was rejected by most American frontier doctors well into the 1880s. The idea that invisible organisms transmitted disease from finger to food was dismissed as European foolishness. So the cook butchered the hog, then sliced the bread, then took the customer's coins, then wiped his nose, then handled the next plate without water, without soap, without a thought. Utensils were no better. The saloon stew ladle was rinsed once a day in a bucket of cold water, already gray with grease. The drinking horn, a single hollowed-out cow horn passed from mouth to mouth at cheaper establishments, carried tuberculosis, syphilis, and the eggs of intestinal parasites between hundreds of customers a week. The shared fork on the free lunch plank was used and returned by men whose teeth were already rotting from scurvy and whose lungs were already failing from consumption. Every meal in a frontier saloon was, in clinical terms, a roll of the dice. And the house always, eventually, won. Forget the gentleman's duel at high noon. Forget the steady-handed sheriff calling out the black-hatted villain in a deserted street. The real violence of the frontier saloon was not noble. It was not choreographed. It was not, in any meaningful sense, brave. It was the violence of a poisoned man with a knife in a dim room thick with smoke, swinging at the closest moving shape. It was the violence of a body chemistry pushed past breaking by industrial alcohol and rancid food, by chronic mercury exposure from prospecting, by lead poisoning from cheap pewter cups, by the slow neurological collapse of men eating embalmed meat and drinking strychnine-laced whiskey 6 nights a week. The frontier saloon was not just feeding desperation. It was manufacturing madness, one plate at a time. The clinical record is unambiguous. Period physicians, writing in journals like the Pacific Medical and Surgical Journal in the 1870s and 1880s, described what they called whiskey madness, a documented syndrome of paranoid rage, visual hallucinations, and explosive aggression that struck men who had been drinking adulterated rot gut for weeks or months on end. We now recognize most of these cases as a combination of acute alcohol poisoning, methanol exposure, lead toxicity, and severe nutritional collapse. At the time, they were simply the price of an evening at the bar. Men killed each other over nothing. A miner in Bodie was shot dead in 1880 over the last pickled egg on the free lunch plank. A bartender in Tombstone was knifed to death in 1881 for serving an oyster that smelled wrong. A cook in a Cheyenne hash house was murdered in his own kitchen in 1878 for undercooking a pot of beans. The statistics destroy the Hollywood image entirely. The Kansas cattle towns of Dodge City, Abilene, and Ellsworth, in their peak years between 1,870 and 1,885, recorded homicide rates that ran, by the most rigorous modern calculations, between 50 and 100 times the rate of any modern American city. Most of these killings did not happen in the street. They happened inside the saloon, often within feet of the bar, frequently over food or the bill for it. The killer was almost never sober. The killer was almost never punished. The body was dragged out the back, the sawdust was raked over the blood, and the next round was poured. But the deeper psychological toll of the saloon plate was not the explosive violence. It was the slow, grinding mental collapse of men who knew, with full clinical clarity, that the food in front of them was killing them and ate it anyway. Frontier diaries from the 1870s and 1880s document this mindset again and again. A miner in Leadville in 1879 wrote, in a letter recovered by historians, that he could smell the rot on the stew set down in front of him, that he had watched the cook scrape mold off the meat, that he knew he would be sick within a day. He ate it. He had no choice. The next meal might not come. The eat or die tomorrow calculus that defined frontier life produced, in its long form, a documented epidemic of nutritional collapse and the mental disorders that came with it. Scurvy, almost forgotten today as a sailor's disease of the 18th century, was rampant in the inland West. Mining camps cut off from fresh produce for months at a time produced documented cases of advanced scurvy in epidemic numbers, bleeding gums, teeth falling out, old wounds reopening as the body's connective tissue dissolved. Pellagra, caused by niacin deficiency and corn-heavy diets, produced its classic clinical triad: dermatitis, diarrhea, and dementia. Beriberi, from thiamine deficiency in saloon diets stripped of any whole grain, produced heart failure and progressive nerve damage. The combined effect was a frontier population, thousands strong, walking through the boomtowns in a state of slow neurological breakdown, depressed, confused, hallucinating, suicidal. The mining camp suicide clusters of the 1870s, documented in coroner's records from Virginia City to Bannock, are now believed by medical historians to be inseparable from the nutritional disaster of the saloon plate. And then there were the women. The history of the frontier saloon woman has been romanticized into a Hollywood cliché of the heart of gold prostitute and the singing dance hall girl, but the documented reality is one of the bleakest chapters in 19th century American history. Saloon prostitutes, dance hall girls, and waitresses lived inside the same toxic food system as the men, ate the same adulterated plate, drank the same poisoned whiskey, and absorbed an additional pharmaceutical horror on top of it all. The laudanum and opium freely available across the West for menstrual pain, for venereal infections, for the simple psychological survival of the work itself. The combination was lethal. Coroner's records from Denver, Cheyenne, Deadwood, and San Francisco's Barbary Coast document a suicide rate among frontier saloon women that historians have estimated, by the most careful counting, at roughly 1 in 4. Carbolic acid, morphine overdose, drowning, self-inflicted gunshot. The methods varied. The cause was the same, a system that consumed them entirely. And below the women, the most forgotten victims of all, their children. Born in saloon back rooms, raised on whiskey-soaked bread, soaked to quiet a teething infant, fed the same formaldehyde milk as their mothers, breathing the same coal smoke, sleeping in the same rat-infested cots. The infant mortality rate in documented saloon districts of the 1870s and 1880s ran, in some boom towns, above 40% before the age of 5. They were buried in unmarked graves on the edges of the camps. They were never counted. They were never named. The necroeconomy ate them too. For nearly 40 years, the necroeconomy of the frontier plate operated in the shadows. The miners who died of dysentery in Leadville were buried without autopsy. The children who died of formaldehyde milk in Deadwood were buried without inquest. The saloon women who took carbolic acid in Cheyenne were buried without name. The food companies in Chicago and Cincinnati that shipped boric acid beef and chalkwater milk and strychnine whiskey across the West grew rich and quiet, and no one with the power to stop them seemed to care. The dead were poor, the dead were far away, the dead, as far as Washington was concerned, did not exist. Then in 1898, the same industrial machine that had been quietly poisoning the frontier for 2 generations made one fatal mistake. It poisoned the United States Army. When American troops shipped out to fight the Spanish-American War in Cuba and the Philippines, they carried with them millions of pounds of canned beef supplied under federal contract by the great Chicago packing houses Armour, Swift, and Morris. It was the same product these companies had been selling to frontier saloons for 2 decades. It was preserved with industrial concentrations of boric acid and salicylic acid. It was, in the clinical sense of the word, embalmed. And in the tropical heat of Cuba, in the field hospitals of Manila, it began to kill American soldiers in numbers that could not be hidden. General Nelson Miles, the commanding general of the United States Army, took the witness stand before a stunned Congress in 1899 and used a single phrase that detonated across American newspapers from coast to coast: embalmed beef. Miles testified that thousands of his men, by some estimates, more than 3,000, had been poisoned by the canned meat in their ration tins. More soldiers had died from this food, he stated under oath, than from Spanish bullets in the entire war. The hearings that followed dragged surgeons, quartermasters, and packing house executives before Congress for the better part of a year. The same chemistry that had been silently feeding the saloons of Tombstone and Tacoma was, for the first time in American history, named, documented, and entered into the public record. The crack widened. In 1906, a young socialist journalist named Upton Sinclair, who had spent 7 undercover weeks inside the Chicago slaughterhouses, published a novel called The Jungle. He had intended to write about the wage slavery of the immigrant meatpackers. What he produced instead was a forensic dismantling of the entire American food supply. A book that described, in clinical detail, rats ground into sausage, tubercular workers spitting on the killing floor, men falling into rendering vats and emerging as lard. President Theodore Roosevelt, reading the book at the White House, reportedly threw his breakfast sausage out the window. Within months, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act. For the first time in American history, formaldehyde milk was illegal. Boric acid beef was illegal. Strychnine whiskey was illegal. The chemistry of the saloon plate, finally, was a federal crime. The technological earthquake that followed buried what the law had killed. The expansion of mechanical refrigeration after 1900, the spread of pasteurization, and the completion of the railroad cold chain made the entire toxic frontier larder obsolete in the space of a single decade. Fresh meat could now reach Wyoming in 2 days, packed in ice, untouched by borax. Real milk could reach Colorado in 24 hours. The economic reason for the embalmed plate, the impossibility of keeping food alive across 1,000 miles of dust, simply vanished. And alongside it, between 1906 and the arrival of Prohibition in 1919, the American saloon itself began to die. The temperance movement, fueled by photographic evidence of saloon conditions that the New Yellow Press had finally begun to publish, swept state after state. Thousands of saloons closed. Tens of thousands. The doors swung shut for the last time on a 60-year reign of culinary brutality. And most of America forgot, almost immediately, that any of it had happened. But the dead remain. They are still out there, in the high desert, and on the wind-scraped plains of the American West, in the unmarked cemeteries that ring every ghost town from Bodie to Bannock to Goldfield. Walk the hill above any of these abandoned camps today and you will find them. Wooden markers rotted to splinters, headstones snapped at the base, mass graves dug in haste during the cholera summers and the typhoid winters, where the cooks and the miners and the saloon women and their nameless children were laid down together by the dozen and covered in the same alkaline dirt that had blown into their food while they lived. The historical record carries fragments of their names. Most do not even have that. The towns themselves stand as physical evidence. Bodie's collapsing saloon walls, Goldfield's empty hash houses, Bannock's rotting bar planks, monuments to a necroeconomy that ate its own population and was abandoned the moment it stopped being profitable. The Hollywood myth came later. The cinematic cowboy, the smiling barmaid, the steaming plate of honest beef and beans, all of it was painted, decade by decade, over the buried statistical truth of what the frontier saloon really was. A parasitic industrial machine, a chemical weapon dressed as hospitality, a graveyard with a liquor license. The plates were cleared, the sawdust was raked, the bar was wiped down, and the men and women who died eating from it were left in the dirt, where they remain, unnamed and uncounted to this day. For 40 minutes, you have walked the dirt floors. You have smelled the rancid lard and the formaldehyde milk. You have seen the engineered chemistry of the free lunch, the wage slavery of the hash house cook, the Chinese immigrant lynched for a fever that was never his fault. You have watched dysentery hollow men out within 48 hours and embalmed beef poison an entire American army. You have stood, by the end, in the unmarked graveyards above Bodie and Bannock, where the saloon women and their nameless children lie under alkaline dirt that no headstone marks and no descendant visits. And here is the final, suffocating truth. The Wild West that Hollywood has sold us for over 100 years. The steady-eyed cowboy, the laughing barmaid, the steaming plate of honest food on a polished bar was painted, frame by frame, over those graves. It was painted to sell tickets, to sell hats, to sell whiskey to a new century that needed a heroic origin story and could not be bothered to count the dead. The real cost of the frontier was not the gunfight. It was not the noble pioneer. It was the 50,000 strong, unnamed army of cooks, miners, immigrants, prostitutes, and infants chewed up and discarded by a parasitic industrial machine that ran on rot and salt and adulterated alcohol. They built the West. They fed it. They died in it. And we erased them so completely that most Americans have never heard a single one of their names. That is the necroeconomy's last and darkest victory. Not just that it killed them, but that we forgot. If you made it through this entire deep dive into the grime of history, comment survive down below, subscribe, because our next documentary goes even darker.